So nice to speak with you all again. This is another topic that is very dear to me when it comes to professional wrestling. The nonprofit experience wrestling that I referred to in my previous presentation has two primary purposes. One is the historical preservation side, and the other side is building a healthy community for professional wrestling. And that's kind of where this conversation ties in. So I have two incredible colleagues who are going to be jumping in with their expertise on the mental wellness and gender identity side, while I'll come in with my background with the cultural wellness. So we're going to have essentially four discussion points. What does cultural wellness mean in the professional wrestling industry, and what does it look like? What impact does gender and sexual identity have on the professional wrestling industry? What is the importance of mental wellness in professional wrestling? And then how does cultural wellness, gender identity, and mental wellness create a well-rounded and healthy community? So the overall, when we talk about the overall wellness of a community, we're looking at several different elements. Those elements together are what makes a community healthy. You can't have you can't be healthy in one individual area and have deficits in the other area and expect to have a whole healthy community. So you have to make sure that you're attending to all those areas. So while there are other elements to a healthy community, cultural wellness, gender and sexual identity, and mental wellness are three major ones. And that's why I wanted to really focus in on these. So before we jump into each of the individual elements and we each kind of talk about our experience in those areas, I do want to talk a little bit about acceptance in the wrestling community. So I'm going to hand that off to Aaron to talk about acceptance with professional wrestlers.
Cheers. Thanks, Milaun. Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Machbitz. For context, I used to be a professional wrestler for like 6 years. So when I speak about this stuff, it's coming from the perspective of an active wrestler, whether that's indie signed. It's all relatively the same struggles that we might be going through. And so as potentially a fan or someone listening or someone who's studying this type of stuff, you might relate to the resulting feelings and emotions that come from chasing your dreams or going after something that's very important to you. And so that's where I'm coming from. And I think the foundation, the thing that sort of ties everything together when we're talking about culture and mental wellness and identity is this idea of acceptance. Now, I think it's important to point out that acceptance doesn't always mean agree, like that those two things aren't the same thing, but there can always be a layer of acceptance that you see another person as they are. And I mean, life is really about being seen and heard. And for me and for a lot of people who get into the professional wrestling space, we felt like we were invisible for a very, very long time. The only people that I hung out with in high school were those who saw my wrestling t-shirts and were wearing the same ones and wanted to hang out. So there's always this beautiful underlying piece of acceptance when it comes to this idea of being a professional wrestler or just loving professional wrestling. And so I think when we start to have these serious discussions about how can we make our community, wrestlers and fans alike, the most healthy community that we can possibly have, it starts with this idea of acceptance and thinking about why you fell in love with the thing anyways. And so an important note to know about wrestlers is that professional wrestling is the thing they love the most, but it's also the thing that gives them the most mental turmoil. And so having that sort of dichotomy and trying to balance that harmony is really hard because they love this thing that they're trying to do, but it's also giving them the most stress. It's probably making them depressed and anxious. And there's not a lot of available resources for people to go to, or people don't understand the struggle or whatever the underlying factors are that's inducing these sorts of behaviors. But if we can get to a point where we just say acceptance is the foundational layer, like imagine if you're building, a massive skyscraper, you have to dig really deep into the ground. Well, the digging deep into the ground part is this idea of acceptance. Because I think about it as a three-step approach. The first is awareness, then we move to acceptance, and then we move to action. Everyone is aware that mental health and mental wellness and culture and gender identity is very, very, very important. Okay, we've become aware of that. We recognize what needs to happen. Now we have to move into an acceptance point, which is really like, this is the reality we live in. Some things are good, some things are not good. We have to accept it as is. so we can move into the next phase, which we will talk about in this presentation, which is action. Like, what can we do about it? Now, it won't be fixed tomorrow, but over a long span of time, we can make those steady increments that can compound over time to create a more healthy community, which everyone involved in loves the thing that we're doing. That's what makes it so special, is that even though we're getting a little bit more mainstream with some of these things with professional wrestling, it's still a very niche audience. And if you're walking down the street or in the grocery store and someone sees you with a wrestling t-shirt on, they may not say something, but they see it. And there's already a bond there that's, can be unbroken based on some of these things that might happen. And I think acceptance of that person, who they are, what they like, what they're about, is a really great starting point. And it's a foundational piece for really, really healthy mental wellness, which of course is paramount to the longevity and the health of performers and people who are in the business, and obviously the people who watch wrestling as well. So that's sort of the starting point. I'll pass it to Milaun. She'll talk about that in sort of a fan perspective.
Yes. When you're talking about acceptance, it definitely can't just be one way. It has to come from both sides, not just the side of the industry. It also has to come from the fan community. The fan community. One beautiful thing that I always love to hear from fans is that the reason, or one of the biggest appeals to them when it comes to professional wrestling, is the fact that they're able to see individuals that look like them, that represent them in some capacity, be it their lifestyle or their culture or anything like that, and find that level of camaraderie with them and that level of acceptance in that. But it needs to kind of go beyond just that acknowledgement of, hey, there's someone here who is like me, and a full acceptance of the different changes that the industry is trying to make in order to improve the lifestyles of the individuals. I think one of the harder issues that we face in the fan community is that sometimes when there's change, it may come off as, oh, but that's less entertaining, or something like that. But if it's for the benefit of the industry, the benefit of the individuals who you are watching, the benefit of, to ensure that they have the best well-being they possibly can, is that an acceptable trade-off? It should be an acceptable trade-off, but being able to have those conversations where you can accept change for the benefit of the industry as a whole, from the fan side as well as the industry side. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into cultural wellness. So historically, professional wrestling has not been known to be culturally conscious. I think we're all pretty much aware of that. From the diversity to the athletes themselves, to the way that cultures were represented, there were many unfortunate, what we will call, missteps. To have cultural awareness is to have an understanding and sensitivity towards the values, beliefs, and traditions of other cultures. It means being willing to have open conversations with individuals of diverse backgrounds to ensure that their needs are met and their identities are respected. So it's both sides. It's making sure their needs are met and that their identities are being respected. So as I said before, when we're talking about acceptance, part of that fan appeal is being able to see people who look like you in the ring. This element has helped grow the wrestling fan base into unique subcultures where you didn't quite see it in years past. But in order to maintain that fan base loyalty and the talent that is representative of them in a positive way, the cultural wellness has to be viewed as a critical function of the promotion itself and that fan community. There admittedly has been a lot of growth in the last few decades as a whole. There was a time when diversity in professional wrestling literally meant creating caricatures of cultures in the ring and forcing athletes to perform roles that went against their cultural beliefs. Those roles were often treated poorly, and it wasn't uncommon to see that individuals who were placed in those roles were not able to reach the same level of ring success as their counterparts. This created tension both for the fans who are watching the shows, who are relating to the community that the individual is representing, and the individual themselves. The early mental impact that this type of environment had on the environment was significant, but I don't think that it has been documented thoroughly enough, for a lot of the same reasons that I mentioned in my previous presentation. As times have changed, we have seen tremendous growth in the willingness to open the doors for others. So in the last few years, WWE has been much more intentional about the diversification of their roster. and providing more opportunities for athletes of diverse backgrounds to hold championships or have major storylines. That was not something that was super common in years past. AEW was founded on the principles of diversity and inclusion, promising a platform for all wrestlers, regardless of background. More now than ever, a fan can look out into the wrestling world and find somebody who they fully identify with, not just culturally, but with their gender, sexual identity, their lifestyle. And as diverse athletes are brought to the table about their own development, storylines are richer and stronger connections to the fan community are created. I personally feel that the storylines that I've seen over the last year or so, the ones that have had the most impact on me are ones that I later on find out the wrestler themselves actually had a lot more insight or had a lot more had more opportunity to play a role in the direction that story went into. So, I mean, that doesn't mean that there isn't growth left to be done in the area of cultural wellness with professional wrestling. Significant issues still exist when it comes to how diverse talent is booked and whether or not they are brought to the table to ensure that they are properly represented and that those storylines are actually richly diverse and not done in a way that is offensive. There is amazing diverse talent all across the country, all across the world, and yet many independent promotions specifically still lack diversity on their rosters, which is really hard to believe when they have individuals right next door who have very diversified rosters. Offensive storylines are still very prevalent. Maybe not so much, maybe not as much in mainstream compared to independent, but it's still very prevalent. And parts of the fan community can be culturally toxic. And this is where, again, it goes back to the fact that the fan community also has to participate in the improvement of the community. Making inappropriate comments that are not addressed by promotion owners have a huge negative impact on the individuals like behind the scenes. A culturally healthy community should feel safe and protected. A large portion of that burden lies with the individual promotions and the leaders within the industry. So not necessarily, the fan base, but a part of that burden does lie with the fan community because they do contribute greatly to the mental well-being of, the individuals in the ring by what they bring to the different shows. So next, I'm going to hand it off to Hollie to kind of talk a bit about gender identity.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hollie McMillan. I also work with Milaun at the University of Texas at Arlington. I recently started my grad program with sociology at the university. And the reason that I decided to go into sociology is because I specifically wanted to do research and contribute to the discussions about gender in wrestling. A little bit about my story on how I even got into wrestling was actually because of AEW. It was this space, like Milaun touched on, that was very diverse and inclusive. And I came into wrestling with this idea that AEW had this is what all of wrestling was like. So, I jump on Twitter and I start engaging with the communities on Twitter of wrestling fans. And it's a very hot area of debate and just kind of cruelty. And part of me wonders, we think about how Vince McMahon had so much control in the world of WWE, WWF, how it was run, the storylines, how every wrestler was supposed to act and what their stories were about. And we see that was a culture that was created, or it drew in a culture that already existed. And now we have its competitor, which is AEW, which, like Milaun said, it is dedicated and working on creating a much more diverse and inclusive place for wrestlers to go. And like Milaun and Aaron touched on earlier, a lot of the support that we need to see to improve the culture of the professional wrestling spaces needs to come from fans. It needs to come from people in the locker room. I believe that we need to really work on our skills of empathy And part of working on our skills with empathy is having curiosity. It is being able to look at people who are different from us and wonder why. Like, what has led you to, hold the beliefs that you do? And that helps us start to humanize people in the same sense that whenever we give this platform to wrestlers with gender identities that are not, the norm of men, whenever they get to enter the ring and the fans get to see them, they get this chance to look at someone that they probably don't have a lot of experience with, and seeing the story and seeing what wrestling can do for the fans and for this wrestler helps humanize this wrestler of a diverse identity or background and such things. So I will go ahead and I will pass it off to Milaun and Aaron for the next parts of our presentation. Oh, Milaun, you're muted.
I feel like I do that all the time in meetings too. The only other thing to add on to gender identity, and I think this kind of ties a little bit when we're talking about like the larger conversations, just like, cultural awareness and things like that, is just the growth that has happened to when it comes to like women's wrestling and things like that, and just giving that additional attention there. But when it comes to women's wrestling and we look at, the evolution that we've had from, the time when they were, the divas and, well, they've gone through quite a few different name changes that have had, various impacts on kind of the way that they're viewed as performers. There has also been significant growth there. And I love the fact that as we got out of the Me Too movement, there was a level of solidarity that existed between the efforts of women wrestlers and the efforts of wrestlers from the LGBT community to really submit their space and create their space, like, and say, I'm here. We saw a growth of, all women promotions. We saw a growth of LGBT oriented shows. So there's definitely been, I think, that little cornerstone there that had come out of the Me Too movement that has been really impactful. And then now we're going to go ahead and let Aaron talk specifically about the mental wellness side before we open it into more general discussion.
Yeah, before I jump in with that, I think sort of the coolest thing we can think about when it comes to gender or sexual identity or any identity basically is that professional wrestling as a whole, wrestlers and fans alike, has the ability to be the most inclusive sport, performance, entertainment entity in the whole world. Like, it literally does, because there can be a role for everyone. And since it's a performance art, like, what a beautiful thing that can allow anyone to do that. And with the storyline aspect, I, as a professional wrestler, was not very good at doing arm drags. No one would know that because I would never do them in the ring. So we have the ability to accentuate everyone's strengths without anyone knowing what they might be lacking or whatever the case may be. Now we can humanize people and allow them to relate to someone who might have that same issue or whatever the case may be. And that's a different story if we're expanding out that person and viewing them as the whole totality of them down the line. But to think that we can be the most inclusive thing and accentuate people's strengths based on the storylines we create, because we have that power to do basically whatever we want. If you work for a different company that, is on TV, you might have less ability to create that, but you still have some say when you stand up for yourself. But based on independent professional wrestling, I mean, that's such a powerful aspect that we have to accentuate people and the beauty that they may possess, because this is an art form and you have the freedom of expression. So we have that in the back of our minds. It's something that we're leaning towards. That's our North Star in terms of all of this stuff. And then you come to this idea of mental wellness, which sort of wraps everything up. And I'll share a quick personal note on why this matters to me so much. And sorry to bring the temperature down a little bit, but I think honesty and transparency is very important. So we'll roll back the time to 2018, where I was actively professional wrestling and living in Philadelphia. I live in Dallas now, close to Milaun. We're buddies. We go to lunch all the time. Anyways, I would assume you guys would assume that because we work together, but off topic. So roll back to 2018. I'm a full-time professional wrestler, and I lose my big sister Rachel to suicide. And at this point in my professional wrestling career, I was pretending to be a movie star, playing named Jackson Stone. I said Lights Camera Jackson was sort of my moniker. The Miz was my favorite wrestler, so maybe you get the comparison. And so when something like that happens, I'm sure people have gone in this room have experienced some very tragic, painful moments. And so when something like that happens, you sort of reevaluate your whole existence. And for me, it pushed me towards thinking more about mental health, mental wellness, suicide prevention, um, how I want to present myself in the ring. Because the biggest turmoil, I think, in professional wrestling, for at least for our mental health, is who we are in the ring and who we are outside of that. Sometimes the two things get so meshed and intertwined that we don't really know who we are. And I personally have defined identity as your repeated beingness, which has nothing to do with your job. It has everything to do with the values and the characters that you want to portray. And if you understand that fully, you can step into the ring as a pretend movie star and then step out of the ring and know this is really who I am. I want to be honest and resilient and kind and careful. And so if we can frame identity in sort of that way as well, then we have a place for professional wrestlers to be who they are in the ring, which could potentially be larger than life or a character or just themselves turned up the volume, whatever the case may be, however the direction they want to go. But then when they step out to be with their friends or go hang out with their family or be a father or mother, they still have their identity intact. So it's not sort of a performance-based identity, more of a character value-driven identity. And so I was struggling with that identity as okay, being this pretend person, but also really, really, really caring about mental health and wanting to talk about it more often. And someone put in the chat about Eddie Kingston, and I was going to touch on that based on what I'm saying here. So then I started talking about mental health on my social media platforms, and I got messages from promoters saying that, hey, Aaron Jackson, whatever, we can't really use you anymore because what you're saying is a little too emotional, and we just can't use you as like a heel or a bad guy on our show. It's too weak. So that's a very interesting conversation. You hear that in 2019. Fast forward to sort of now, what Eddie Kingston is doing is blending the two. He's being a very real, genuine human being who also can kick some freaking ass, right? And that's really what it's about because people are complex and we have a lot of emotions, but we can also stand up for what we believe in. So what Eddie Kingston is doing is being the most authentic version of himself, and that is something that we can admire as a man, as a fan, all of that stuff. And so that's my thought on Eddie Kingston. He's amazing. But and so then as I'm working through this thing that happened with my sister talking about mental health more often, I start to understand how deeply suicide has impacted the professional wrestling industry. Because for some reason it just wasn't in my purview until this moment. And then I realized that since I lost my sister, I've lost a lot of friends since that time in the professional wrestling space to suicide. And so when we think about mental health, yes, it's how we think, feel, and act, but also mental health is not just a psychological thing. Everything outside of us affects how we think, feel, and act. That's why culture and gender and sexual identity and the community aspect and all of these other things have a deep impact on the way someone thinks, feels, and acts. So it's looking at the totality of all these things in combination, how they impact each other, and how we can keep wrestlers, basically, to say it very bluntly, alive because they're dying more often than I really care to think about in this moment. Because I think about it very, very, very often. Obviously, that's why this conversation is very important to me. And so, what we need to do is one, we're having awareness, right? But the next I talk about is acceptance, great. But now we got to move into the action. We have to do something about it. And it starts obviously with conversations, but it starts with everyone coming together that recognizing there's an issue and where can we move to then? What can we do about these things that allow wrestlers to become more proactive with their mental health? So when there is an issue or they feel this thing or they have this going on or something doesn't go well or there's a tough conversation they need to have, they have the tools available to them, either that they know already because they've learned from a seminar or conference or a community meeting that they can go implement, or they have a place to land where they can talk this out with someone. And so we're going to get to some actionable steps here in a second. I touched on probably the most important one, which would be community. But we have to think about, again, what I said earlier is that professional wrestling is the thing that we love the most, but also creates the most mental turmoil. And I think understanding that piece is the most important, because then we have a place to go. We have a place to work from. We know that this is the thing I love, but also the thing that causes me a lot of pain. And where can I find some middle ground in there to maintain my true identity, my repeated beingness, build my character value, my value-driven identity, rather than my performance-based identity, which is all about, you know, how people perceive me in the ring, what people are saying on social media. Yes, those things might be important for the trajectory of your career, but what's more important is your livelihood, your well-being, your health, and that creates more longevity in your career. And if we can encourage professional wrestlers to be their most genuine, authentic selves, whether they're playing a character or not, is still possible. Because one of the hardest things we think about with this stuff is that professional wrestling was built on lies and bullshit, excuse my language, right? It was meant to fool people into thinking what we were doing was the most realist thing possible. Yes, there's a lot of really hard, true, painful aspects of being into professional wrestling. None of it is easy, but it is a predetermined sport. But we were trying to fool fans for a very long time. And so when real things get interjected into the professional wrestling conversation, people are a little bit nervous about it because they don't know if someone's trying to fool them or not. And that conversation was brought up a little bit earlier about storylines that are happening currently. We don't know what's real or what's not. And that conversation is also happening backstage. Why is this person being nice to me? Why is someone who's not in professional wrestling coming to talk about community and diversity and inclusion? Why? What are they doing? Do they want something from me? Like, everything is built on that. And so that makes everything more challenging to get this conversation going, because people who are trying to quote unquote protect the business don't see how this can benefit them because they think it's all lies and bullshit. Again, excuse my language, but that's the process we're trying to undo, while also keeping the mystique of professional wrestling. Because when I watched WrestleMania a couple weeks ago, I was like, this is freaking amazing, right? The belief was still suspended. I was like super, like, loved it, right? We still want to have that where we can get attached to the storylines and feel some emotion, because every single person who watches professional wrestling or have done professional wrestling can pinpoint a time in their life where professional wrestling saved them. At least I can. I know the exact moment. I had a match 30 days after my sister passed away with a buddy of mine who's going to be in my wedding. You may know him. He's on AEW. He's called Wheeler Yuta. He saved my life, because when she passed away, I had that match planned with him. I had something to look forward to. If I had nothing to look forward to, I don't know what I would have done. You know, I had other people supporting me, but I had the constant conversations with him about, hey, dude, we're looking forward to this match. Let's do this. Let's do that. Just a little bit to keep my mind off the fact that I lost someone that I love the most. And I bet everyone can pinpoint its time in their life where they're going through something really hard, and professional wrestling was there. And so that idea is so powerful to extend this conversation, and then, you know, sort of nudge our way into making people believe that what we're doing is actually trying to help, not, you know, whatever wrestling was built on of lies and all that garbo, but still also trying to maintain the mystique of, you know, this is a performance. Let's suspend our belief a little bit. Let's buy in, but also let's protect the people who are performing in the ring mentally, physically, emotionally, you know, spiritually, all of that stuff. And so I said a lot there, but very passionate about it. So anyone has any other points, Milaun, you can go to the next thing.
Milaun, you're muted again.
Goodness, I'm just going to leave myself unmuted for the rest of this. But there was a great comment in the chat too, Aaron, if you wanted to take a look at that one before we move
Sure.
on.
Giving kayfabe does being authentic about one's mental health run the risk of backfiring? 100%, it has a chance of backfiring. Sure, like, yeah, that's a heavy risk you're willing to pay. That's a heavy risk that I was willing to pay when I first started talking about it. But I think you're expressing yourself in that genuine way is going to ultimately make you feel better about yourself and who you are, rather than compromising your values and beliefs to wrestle for some, deal or promotion where they're going to pay you a little bit of money. You have to be able to sort of zoom out, extend over the long haul. Like, what does this mean for me in 2, 3, 4, 5 years when I stick to doing this thing about being authentic and being values driven? Yeah, it might backfire in the beginning because people might not understand, but over the long haul, I think it's more beneficial. And Eddie Kingston is a testament to that. I mean, the guy's been wrestling for like 20 years, and he's finally getting the flowers that he deserves. And we should give people their flowers early, especially while they're alive, not when they've gone, because they can't feel that or see that or hear that. But he's a testament to that. Yeah, it backfired for him early on. He was too this, too that, too open, whatever, whatever, whatever. But he stuck with it because he knew that was in him. And I think that's the most powerful thing we can do. So thank you for that question. Beautiful.
And I did want to say something that you brought up, Aaron, about you said something about values, and it reminded me that a huge part of the research that I want to do, that I would love to see have a larger impact on society in general, is the values that wrestlers show through their characters, and how important it is that these values, of diversity and inclusion, when you look at the nuances of professional wrestling, it's so much more than just this aggressive like fighting and theatrics of that, but it's like there are real emotional connections between wrestlers and their stories. Whether or not it's kayfabe, it's still a good example of friendships and relationships and working through conflicts and stuff like that. So I think that like professional wrestling has such a unique position to really be a space that offers values and offers their perspective for people who may not have that in their own lives in other places. And it just adds to the importance of this conversation to happen, for us to be open and honest in these spaces.
So absolutely, 100%.
All right. So how do we improve? How do we make our community healthy and completely well, so to speak? So we identified 3 key areas: organizational responsibility, the demand for change, and having empathy, which all in all kind of just fit within just building and having a solid community. So we're all going to just kind of talk a bit about how within our individual areas, and a lot of it will kind of sound the same, because I think at this point we're talking about how to improve cultural wellness, mental wellness, and the gender identity and sexual identity. It all tends to come down to a lot of the same 4 things. And I would even argue that cultural wellness and gender and sexual identity, in the end, kind of flow directly into mental wellness when it comes to kind of what's occurring there. I would say, and I know through conversations I've had for the last year with different promotions and such like that, as I've tried to help them build policies around some of this work, I would argue that the primary responsibility for some of this improvement does lie with the promotions themselves to rebuild. And I'm not even gonna say rebuild, because it's not about rebuilding, it's about completely changing the culture that currently exists within professional wrestling to where it does not have the level of toxicity that currently exists when having these type of conversations, but it's also open to the change that hopefully individuals will start demanding so that we can make some of those improvements. On the cultural wellness side specifically, we're talking about organizational responsibility. It is a promotion's responsibility, and I love that AEW specifically has been doing this more. I feel like I've heard quite a few good stories from WWE as well, but not nearly as many, where in doing some of those storylines, the individuals who are being presented in those storylines are included from the very beginning in those conversations about how they should be represented. And they're actually given that leeway to kind of like say, like, no, this does not represent me in the way that I think is best. We need to do something different. Before, it was very much so. And even now in independent area, I think the independent scene is probably struggling with it a little bit more. But if an individual is presented with something that does not sit right with them, they are at risk of not being able to get future bookings. They may end up being passed over for the show that they're talking about right then. But that booker, that promoter only has to make a quick phone call or send a quick text message and say, oh man, this wrestler was difficult. They didn't want to do this storyline. They were being too sensitive. And now that individual doesn't have certain bookings that they may have been able to get before. So, on the independent level, a lot of individuals are kind of forced to choose between speaking up and saying, hey, this doesn't feel right for me, or potentially losing out, and then losing out on those bookings. Whereas, when you get to mainstream wrestling with WWE and AEW, I think because they are larger organizations, and I think more importantly, because they actually operate like a business. If you're not familiar with independent promotions, many of them do not operate in the same form. And when I say that, I mean like they don't have organizational documents. They don't have like distinct policies about how things should operate. Many independent promotions do not have that. WWE and AEW obviously do because they are much larger, and I think that is probably why they are a little bit more evolved, so to speak, in that regard. But it's the promotion who has to make the space for the wrestlers and other individuals working within the industry to feel comfortable to come to them and say this isn't right for me, or whatever, or else they're not going to. Or in the case of independent promotions, they're going to break off and create their own promotion, and that's why we have 91 promotions in the state of Texas. What are there any? I'm sure there's additional things, Hollie or Aaron, that you want to kind of pull in when it comes to like organizational responsibility.
Yeah, I mean it's like I said, it's just challenging to get buy-in, because it just takes a long time for people to believe intentions are true. And so the important part is wrestlers and fans being very vocal about the need for this type of stuff to happen. Like I run a mental health nonprofit called You Are Loved, and for the past 3 years, we've been running mental health support groups specifically for professional wrestlers. Um, and it's challenging to get people involved, even though this is a very serious, complex thing specifically about mental health of professional wrestlers. And so, yeah, over time, it's all going to play out quite well. But just understanding that the community aspect of all of it is the most important part, like a place for people to have honest, clear dialogue about issues or what they're going through, or stories they might want to share where people can respond and help or just listen. And then we can create adequate change moving in that direction based on how we're feeling in that moment, or what majority of wrestlers are talking about, or the case may be. And so we are moving in the right direction based on the work that the three of us have seen and the progress we're making. But a lot more improvements can be made. I think, and a really important note based on mental health, is that AEW does have a sports psychologist on staff who travels with the organization to every single show. They have psychiatrists, they have medical staff. And so they've seemed to create that there's a priority for the emotional well-being of their talent. I know WWE has the same thing. And so hopefully that trickles down into, independent professional wrestling, just having a body, a community, a group that is talking about that stuff. So when someone seems to be going on a dark path or feel like no one's around or they're alone in their struggles, they can go to a community and see that no, you're not alone. Like we're all feeling like tired and worn out and stressed, and like, is it worth it, or whatever the case may be. And so there's that sense of community that I think is the most important part when we're thinking about this action piece and moving towards creating necessary change.
And I hope that overwhelmingly people have more hope now for the future and for diversity and inclusion in all areas of life to be something that we can work on together. Because I don't think that AEW and the place that it has in our culture now would be possible without the broader culture having changed and having grown itself. And I think that something that's very important for us to do is in our daily lives to, act upon the values that we hold and treat people with the kindness and dignity that we want to see in these spaces as well, because it helps set a new standard for people whenever we are able to treat everyone with dignity and respect, because then that becomes the expectation that it's already been there to begin with, that that's what people deserve.
For sure.
Yeah, I think that really ties in great when we're talking about like the importance of having empathy and one so I think it was probably maybe about 5 weeks ago or so. I had a really wonderful opportunity. I was invited by the owner of DFW Off-Road, a promotion down here in Texas, to experience what it would be like to be a professional wrestler. I'm going to say now, I have no desire to be a professional wrestler. I never have. I just have a love for the industry. But, with my background and experience and learning, I couldn't turn down the opportunity to learn through doing. And in doing that, I had so many revelations, not only in just the amount of just what they put themselves through. I spent 4 hours doing rolls, learning how to take bumps, doing way more push-ups and sit-ups than I ever thought I would have to do in my life. But it gave me such a deep appreciation for what the wrestlers have to go through. And I think that's an element that does not exist right now in the fan community. And we've talked about this a bit already because there's so much mystery behind the professional wrestling industry. I think because individuals in the fan community don't fully see the amount of work and dedication and even just the true level of pain that they actually put themselves through just to put on a show is unfortunate, because I do think that if people saw that, they would have a lot more empathy for what's happening in the ring. They would actually probably appreciate the sport a lot more. And I think that they would actually enjoy it more. Me watching a show now, since I had that experience, I absolutely, like, when I'm watching a show now, I'm in awe even more, because I'm remembering that bump that I took when I hit the mat and, I started throwing up for 30 minutes. And I'm like, man, they just took a really bad bump and they got back up. I am so impressed. And that's something that's missing. So having those conversations and being open about the true experiences, I think would help the fan community have more empathy, which in turn would allow the wrestlers to have a little bit more mental security, because again, the fan community can be pretty toxic. I'm sure if anybody is on Twitter, they see the things that are put out there. And, we don't live in a silo. Wrestlers don't see this information and think, oh, that's just a fan. That's nothing. This can be internalized. So, we also have to contribute to their well-being. If we love these individuals so much, if we, value the work that they do so much, we have to be willing to take care of them just as much as they're willing to entertain us. So, like, everyone has to be willing to say, this is not right. We need to do something different. And I will put into the chat before the presentation is over the blog post that I wrote about that experience, because it was very insightful. So if anyone is interested, please read that. There's a question here. What can professional wrestling fans do to help all this occur?
I mean, you just basically answered that one, but
I was going to add to the conversation that specifically to answer that question, something that I see a lot, because I'm pretty active on Twitter about, following all the different wrestlers, and I specifically follow a certain promotion. But I do enjoy seeing all the news about wrestling in general because I love the sport. But I think that the biggest issue we're facing in our community is the tribalism that's going on between promotions. I think that we really need to, like what Milaun and Aaron are saying, we really need to focus less on the promotions and we need to focus on the wrestlers. We need to focus on, the word just went out of my head. We need to focus on supporting the wrestlers. We need to focus on making this a more sustainable career choice. And as far as what the fans can do, because we have social media, we can speak to each other. We can speak directly to wrestlers and promotions. We can, ask for accountability. we can share our opinions. I think that in doing that, though, we also have to be respectful. We also can't turn into mobs. We have to understand that at the end of the day, all wrestlers, everyone working in a promotion, they are all run by people just like us who are probably going to be hurt by mean comments. And that, you know, goes directly into the empathy of like, we just need to have empathy for each other, because no matter what promotion you like, no matter what wrestler is your favorite, we're all going through the same things. We're all dealing with the same hurts and daily things. So yeah, just being empathetic.
Awesome. So we did want to open it up to just kind of have like open discussion. I know we've had some questions before. This screen is not very good for me looking at questions though. So if anyone has any thoughts or any questions, please let us know.
Erin, I think there's a good question that somebody just asked that you could answer.
Oh yes, okay. Yeah, that's all you, Aaron.
Professional resolution. That's a good question. The answer is very insightful, and it's both. There's going to be times where like the show must go on is going to encourage me to sort of get up and go, like I talked about with my sister, right? That show has to happen. I needed that to help me get up and go. Now, I don't know if you're talking specifically about in the midst of a match where something might happen. In that context, that you got to sort of figure out what's happening. Like I had a match where I got hit with a steel chair in the back of my head and started bleeding everywhere. I knew that the show did not need to go on. I left. Okay. Because my brain and me bleeding everywhere is not more important than the match I was having. So that in the midst of a match, sort of the show must go on, injury type stuff, you got to sort of figure it out as you go. I know CM Punk recently talked about it on an interview with, I think, the Royal Rumble, right? He felt like he could still go on. It wasn't going to get worse. So he decided to keep moving forward. But most of the time when we're going through something hard in our life, it does allow us to concentrate on something moving forward, help us see something in the future that we can work towards, or at least potentially even stay alive for. And so that show must go on mentality can be really powerful. But also knowing that maybe you need to take a break, like maybe there's something is going on that you need to do take time off, and taking time off is sometimes viewed as a professional wrestler's worst nightmare, because there's always other people coming in who might take that spot or might do this or might do that. But just to, you know, as a wellness tip as a whole, right? You can't be anything to anyone else if you're first nothing to yourself. And that goes with your mind, your body, your spirit. So maybe, yeah, taking 6 months off might be bad in the short term, but 3 or 4 years from now, when you can do all the things you couldn't do here because you didn't take the time off, you could do them now. There's long-term benefit to that. So also having perspective and being able to zoom out and maybe take a bird's eye view of your career, where you want to be, what your ultimate trajectory is, and that these next 6 to 12 months aren't make or break. You just might have to take that time, recoup, rejuvenate, and then get back at it moving forward. And so to answer your question, it's both, but thank you. Very good question.
And I do want to piggyback off of that because Aaron made a really great point when talking about wrestlers kind of looking back on their career. Because that was kind of one of the more interesting things that I realized as I started working with promotions and independent wrestlers is that they're so caught up in making it to the big stage that they don't take that time to actually reflect on what they've already accomplished. So one of the really cool things that I've had the wonderful opportunity to do over the last 2 years is actually just sit down with wrestlers and like have them like literally write out every match they've gone into and just sit down and talk about it. And in those conversations, it's always like without fail, it's always like a shock moment for them to realize how much they actually have accomplished in the time that they've been a professional wrestler. Because again, their mind is literally just on that end goal of making it to AEW, WWE, you know, NJPW or whatever. And it's not usually like really just looking at their career as a whole. And that definitely has a significant impact on, you know, their mental well-being. Do we have any other questions or thoughts around how to make a healthy, supportive wrestling community? And fans can definitely, I think fans are are a huge part of that for sure. I
Tyler?
think I see a hand up for Tyler.
I see a hand raised. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was actually I'm not good at pointing out like what articles and stuff, but I was reading this one article one time, and they were talking about like the history of wrestling. And one of the points it made was that and like they were talking about the connection between wrestling and capitalism. And sort of talking about they said that wrestling's first instinct is to make money and then it's to entertain people. And I think like uh I study like a lot of like African centered psychology specifically as well. And one of the things that it talks about is like this idea um of 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 completely flipping a dynamic or a concept on its head. And I think that if we were to quite literally take that quote and flip it and sort of make entertainment and togetherness in the sense of community that we feel the focal point of professional wrestling, and then the secondary goal being to make money for whatever reason, I think that would also be a really good step in the right direction. Just because, like, if we're talking like in some sort of fever dream, like if I were to uh make my own professional wrestling company, like it wouldn't be a company, like it'd be a theater production, for the purpose of like emphasizing storytelling, characters, uh because at the end of the day professional wrestling is self-expression, at like really, and that being said, like from the characters that people have, from the things that they make these characters say, the ways in which they act, like we can tell a lot from who people actually are under these characters. And so that tells a lot about like the things that, you know, need to be paid attention to. So I all in all, I think like if we were to really emphasize the sense of community and the entertainment and the art form itself over the intent to make money with it, then that I think that's a really good like first step forward.
I
I think
absolutely agree, and that's 100% what our purpose and our aim is to. One thing to kind of put that into context, and I think it's probably the biggest difficulty for independent wrestling, that's kind of sets them apart from mainstream. You don't make money in independent wrestling, and I say this both for wrestlers and for promotions. You don't make money. Our nonprofit, we have run a couple of different shows, and when we go into doing our shows, we don't go into it with the expectation to make any money. We go into it with the expectation of putting on a good show. Other promoters, I would say probably about 50 to 60% of them probably go into it just hoping that they're going to break even and that they're going to be able to cover the costs that they have to cover. And that usually means, giving wrestlers the short end of the stick, unfortunately, and not paying them very well. So, that financial side, the money, it's a huge motivator. So I completely agree. If we were able to switch that mentality, especially on the independent level, well, no, I'm not going to say especially. I think both would benefit from it, but I think that there would be a much bigger jump and improvement on the independent side because not only will they see improvement in the community itself, but I do 100% believe that if that were to change, they would also see a financial gain, a financial improvement as the culture improved.
I was going to say, yes, I absolutely agree with that. It's the idea of art for art's sake, of, sadly in the society that we live in, it's all related to how much money can it make me, because we live in a society where we have to make money to live. And that's kind of like what Milaun is saying, is that these wrestlers are doing this for the money in the hopes of getting a bigger paycheck with a different promotion one day. And there are definitely wrestlers who do it for the love of wrestling, for sure. But I think again, in order to really help make promotions sustainable and to let wrestlers be able to do wrestling in a sustainable, healthy way where the culture is healthy and everything is good, is that we really need to start having these conversations just in general in our lives, like wherever we go, being able to discuss these things and kind of just have these open and honest conversations about why are things the way they are.
Sorry, I'm reading comments. This is a great comment in the chat too.
Yeah.
About how pro wrestling fans get caught up on ratings and things like that. Like that's so absolutely true. And I think that kind of ties into what, you know, you were talking about, Holly, when it comes to the tribalism that kind of exists, you know, across like the mainstream and promotions and such. And it's interesting because you're right. They do use it to validate their own identity. And I see this the most when we're talking about some of the toxic conversations that kind of take place on social media. So that's a really great point.
Yeah, for sure.
And I like the idea of a professional wrestling co-op, but I will say on the independent side, that's hard. All right, thank you all so very much. I really appreciate y'all taking the time to listen to us talk about this. We're very passionate about creating a healthy community for professional wrestling.
Yeah. Thank you for your time.